Hello, this is John Anhalt for Drivehud.com, and this video is going to be about open button versus a big blind defense call, and how to pick up these extra pots you might be missing with some overbets on the river. I decided to do this video because I've sat in on a number of sessions where small mid-stakes players are missing these pots a lot, and these kinds of pots add up over time. I mean, any pot that you can win obviously is going to add to your win rate long term, but these are really simple pots to look for that players I think skip and miss a whole lot, and it's really simple formula to apply to get these. So I know you'll start doing better at these if you make it through this video here. And I'm going to start off. And so what's the scenario? I'm just going to define it real quick. It folds to you on the button. You open raise. Whatever your open raise size is fairly irrelevant here. I mean, most of the time, if you open raise a slightly larger size, your big blind's defense should be a little better. That's not always the case. If you feel like you have enough data on your opponent and you can make that assessment, then you want to apply that information when you're deciding how you're going to play and try and steal this pot. But in general, I'm not going to be too concerned about that. I'm going to show one example, and the open raise is 3 times the big blind from the button. So like I was just saying, these are profitable spots I see players missing all of the time, a lot. And I'm talking good small and mid stakes players. So I want to run through exactly what you should be looking for. And um, essentially, you want to target standard tags, multi-tabling tags are the best. Some bad players that can fold hands. Definitely not your sticky fishes or anyone who has a high win to showdown rate. Make sure if you're looking at those win to showdown stats that you have a very high number of hands on your opponent, or their number is so outside of the range, it's so high that you can conclude they're probably going to show down too often. Um, you can do this against fish as well. You just want to make sure that your opponent has, and actually some, reasonably okay fish are great targets because they'll typically defend and they like to call a lot of hands a little too often, but they will make a lot of mistakes in their decision making process. So those are the players we want to target. Another part of this is you want to keep the pot pretty small, and that's mainly because, especially multi-tabling tags, players in general, they will, on more difficult decisions, if the pot's not very big, they'll tend to kind of fold and move on to the next hand. That's kind of just a natural reaction if it's a stressful situation and you're applying a lot of pressure to your opponent. If it's not something they're going to be losing a lot, then they'll usually just kind of and toss their hand in. As the pot grows, then usually more thought goes in, and there's going to be situations where you'll probably be called a little narrower than you normally should be, because there's more at stake. So that's just human nature. Make sure that when you are playing your hand, and I'm going to give you an example here in 1 minute, that you're telling the story correctly. That's the biggest thing. I mean, this, and maybe I didn't say that from the beginning, but we're going to be bluffing. We don't have a hand, or maybe you have a bottom pair, something that is not good, that cannot win at showdown. Anytime you're turning your hand into a bluff, you want to make sure that how you played the hand is consistent with the story that you're trying to tell. So your range matches how your actions end up by the time you get to the river. And finally, you're slightly overbetting on the river. And when I mean slightly overbet, I literally mean one big blind, 2 big blinds or so more. So it looks, it is an overbet to your opponent. It's not just a pot size bet. And now they tend to just go into a separate thinking phase rather than just, even if you're potting a bet on the end, just making that slightly overbet tends to get people outside of their box a little bit more, which is what we want to do. Not in a way that they get too curious, where they're like, huh, what's going on here? Although of course that will happen in any scenario like this, you're gonna play this situation perfectly, and you're still gonna get someone to call you. It's gonna happen, but with poker, the goal is that you're doing this consistently in the right spots over time, and then it'll yield profit. So let's get to the example. Okay, so this is one of those typical examples I was referring to. This is a standard 6 max small stakes 25 NL game. Um, and doing this is going to apply to pretty much all stakes, all the way up into high stakes. Obviously, the better your opponent is, the more you're going to want to make sure that you're value betting thinner with some of these small overbets and these open button spots. The better your opponent, they're obviously going to understand the dynamics a little bit better. But small stakes games, 50 NL under. If you keep the pot a relatively somewhat smaller size pot, and you make a tough decision in a spot where you have a much wider range and can rep a much wider range, your opponent's going to fold a large percentage of their hands. So, um, you know, you just want to keep that in mind. It's kind of the equation, right? You can rep a somewhat wider range because they don't really know exactly how wide you're opening on the button. Some people open extremely wide. Even if they have a little bit of history with you, that range to normalize is going to take a little while. So just want to take advantage of that and get them to fold out a lot of their weaker range. So here, 6 max, standard open button with king 9 offsuit, get a big blind defense. Board comes completely dry, one single Broadway card, check, bet. Sometimes you can even bet smaller than this, but I like building a pot knowing that I'm probably going to steal later if I don't end up hitting. And get a call. So, we know his range is any of these. 5 deuce, jack, could be some small pairs. He's kind of tight, so there could be a lot of 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, so on, 7s, even some ace high, ace 4, things of that nature. And so we get a call. Turn comes a brick. Most of the time here, again, kind of the formula is you don't want to get the pot too big. I like betting a little bit larger on the flop just to kind of get some of their total air range out, or to build to where I can steal it better. But you bet the turn and then you bet the river, then you start getting into a phase where people will consider the call a lot more, where if they're a multi-tabler, they'll tend to move on in some of these smallish pots. But anyways, action goes check, check. Um, Pretty standard. I mean, I could rep 5-4 and continue to kind of bet here. I don't hate that, but again, trying to kind of stick to the formula. Now river comes off 7. This is much better for our range than his range. He could be defending with 5-7, but most likely he would probably bet here. I mean, sometimes he could be, betting to induce a bluff. But this definitely, hits some of our range, something that we might have checked. So we want to look at what are we repping here. We can rep, 6-8, 5-7, Jack 7. Again, 5-4, but the hand's probably going to bet the turn a large percentage of the time. But a lot of those hands kind of fit a hand. We might bet the flop, check turn, and now overbet river. And again, he has 5 deuce. A jack is going to be the hardest in his range to get him to fold, obviously. But some of his weaker jacks that he might be defending with, jack 8 and under, he might consider a fold when it's, you're putting him to a slight overbet. And it's just literally 1 or 2 big blinds over the pot size. And he does think for a while and then eventually fold. So that's pretty common breakdown. Just make sure as you build history. I like doing these value bets with these slight over bets with top pair with good kickers. Um, you know, and obviously, especially with big made value hands and what have you. But this will allow you to apply a lot more pressure. And some of these opponents, especially this kind of opponent, in this case is like 1917, even though there's only about 100 hands on him. Some of these guys eventually also might just give up their big blind because they don't want to have to defend and continue to face a lot of difficult decisions. Again, multi-tablers are a little more apt to just kind of fold and move on. So, yeah, I just, summary is here. You just want to make sure you're taking advantage of these spots. These add up, a session, and in one single session, you're playing 300 to 1,000 hands, somewhere in that range. You're going to face this a few different times. So, you definitely want to make sure that you are taking advantage of this. And like I said, end of the month, end of the year really does add up.